In the preseason of Diablo 4's release, the Infinimist Necromancer clearly and very quickly rose to prominence as one of the safest Nightmare Dungeon pushing builds because it was effectively immortal the entire time that you were in Bloodmist. Later on in Season 1 with the addition of the Barber Heart, it got an even larger impact in its overall damage output because now all of its AoE damage and its damage over time was able to crit. Well, with the changes coming in Season 2, it turns out that they want us to move away from crit, they want us to move away from vulnerable as the only damage types that are available. And oddly enough, this has made the Infinimist Necromancer even stronger. What I have for you is the theory craft in a D4 build planner. I'll have timestamps down to everything below. You can come check out the Discord with the recently fixed Discord link down in the description. Thank you to the viewers who pointed that out. And you can actually take a look at this build planner as I'm theory crafting these walking into this season. I have an entire channel in the Discord there where you can go find it. Let's go ahead and walk through the differences of this build. The fact that I have over 1,000 intelligence that now scales our strongest Paragon Glyphs and our strongest Paragon legendary power, on top of the fact that they added 2 other glyphs, which depending on how they work, could add another 1,000 additive damage to this build. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and jump into the planner. While I went into a pretty exceptional amount of detail for the Bloodlands Theorycraft build video, I want to try to keep this one a little simpler, and I just want to touch on the very key factors that went into how we changed this build. Because ultimately a lot of what we're using is similar to what Infinimist looks like right now on max roll, but we have a completely different Paragon setup. There are 2 other Paragon glyphs that we might use in this build, which we'll go over, that are in the patch notes. And there's a lot of interesting retooling as far as gems, primary stats, and how we're building out everything in general. Shadowblight still does the instance of 22% damage whenever you hit a target with 10 instances of shadow damage in a row. The big difference here is that they've added on a new multiplier for this damage that didn't exist previously, and that's your coefficient of shadow damage over time. A stat that could never apply to this since it's not an instance of damage over time. This stat would only increase things like your corpse explosion damage, your bone storm damage, etc. But now you gain 100% of your shadow damage over time as a new multiplier of Shadowblight's proc damage. On top of that, they moved all of the darkness skills scaling Paragon stats away from willpower, a stat that did absolutely nothing for our build, and onto intelligence instead. So the Wither legendary node now looks at intelligence, your darkness glyph now looks at intelligence, and Scourge now looks at intelligence. So not only does every single Paragon board that we have available to us just give us more intelligence around a glyph socket than willpower ever could, reaching all the way up to 75 total intelligence, Scourge, which only scaled your damage over time, can now be added on to scale your Shadowblight's damage, and Wither, which used to cause you to want to invest in willpower, now also scales off of intelligence. So if we go back to my character, you'll notice that we're sitting at just over 1,000 intelligence. This Scourge glyph on our base board is going to have 70 total intelligence around it. That means it's going to be 14 times roughly 10 damage. So it's going to be almost 140 additive damage over time, as well as the free 1.1 multiplier if we deal shadow damage over time to a target. Darkness in the Flesh Eater board, which has 75 intelligence around it, means that we're going to be gaining nearly 150% additive darkness damage, with the added benefit of reducing income and damage from monsters that are affected by shadow damage over time. The Wither legendary node is now also scaling off of intelligence, and I'll very quickly run you through how this works. The base stat just says that it has a 5% chance anytime a shadow damage over time effect is applied to a target. So Blighted Corpse Explosion does 12 instances of shadow damage over time. You'd have a 5% chance of multiplying that damage by 1.5, a free 50% damage multiplier. Now, it only occurring 1 in every 20 damage ticks is obviously not impressive at all. But the next part is what's really important. For every 40 intelligence now that you have, you'll increase the chance that it occurs by 1%, and you'll increase the damage by 4%. Well, if you take 1,000 intelligence divided by 40, I'll do the math for you, it is 25. That means that we now have a 30% chance, so 3 out of 10, of increasing our damage by 2.5, a 150% additional multiplier on every single instance of shadow damage over time that we apply. Now here's what we can't really build into the planner right now because obviously the patch hasn't gone live, the data doesn't exist. There's also 2 new glyphs that are coming to the Necromancer. The first one, Exhumation, which is going to increase corpse skill damage by 14% for every 5 intelligence within range. The secondary effect meaning that you gain damage reduction and also fortify, which is definitely pretty good. but it does mean that if we were to swap this down into any good intelligence node with 70 intelligence, let's go ahead and call it in the Paragon board, means that we're gaining close to 200% additive corpse skill damage, which is obviously a huge benefit to our corpse explosion. Now that one might be a little bit too niche because we do want to do damage from a lot of different sources. It's desecration that is very, very interesting here. Desecration says for every 5 willpower, so the most willpower we could get is 54, you increase your desecrated ground damage by up to 60%. So on a 54 will Paragon Glyph node, you're basically gaining 600% additive desecrated ground damage. What is desecrated ground? There are only a few effects in the game which specifically refer to desecrated ground. The first one would be the desecrated ground left behind whenever you use Sever from the Grease of the Empty Tomb unique item, which would definitely be cool, right? That's a nice little bump up to that damage. And then there is also when you use Ultimate Shadow. Ultimate Shadow says that Blood Wave will desecrate the ground it travels over. Nothing else really talks about desecrated ground though. My initial feeling is that Blighted Corpse Explosion, which leaves behind a miasma on the ground, may be considered desecrated ground, as well as Blight leaving behind a defiled area might be considered desecrated ground. If not, it means that this glyph is only in place for only Sever Necromancers to use with boots, or with specifically Ultimate Shadow on only Bloodwave. So it's hard to say right now whether or not we're going to use these glyphs. If it turns out it applies to Corpse Explosion or Blight, you know I'm going to throw it onto this build somewhere because that is a ridiculous amount of additive damage. But at least for right now, we're keeping it out of the build because we don't really know how it works. Okay. That's it for the biggest changes. I'm going to very quickly go through the skill tree just for people who like to hear it read out as opposed to looking at it visually. We're still using Reap on our skill bar with the ability to generate a corpse. 3 points in New Hued Flesh to be able to generate corpses because that's the name of the game for this build. Maxing out Blood Mist to reduce its cooldown since we want to get to Infinimist, and the fact that it generates corpses as well, so we have more targets for a corpse explosion. Maxing out Corpse Explosion, and the cool thing about this is that it also means we might be able to use Black River in Season 2 since they have drastically buffed that item. Until I test it out myself, I'm not just going to go ahead and tell you that it's best in slot. It now gives additional ranks to Hued Flesh, and hopefully they also fix the bug where it wouldn't increase its radius on Blighted Corpse Explosion. Until we can test it though, I'm not going to tell you to rush out and try to target farm it. Obviously maxing out Fueled by Death for the additional damage after consuming a corpse. We're picking up Decrepify with Abhorrent to be able to proc the cooldown reduction, Amplify, as well as Death's Embrace. Then we're maxing out everything in the Shadow passives tree. We want all that movement speed from Reaper's Pursuit. We want to be applying as much length of stun as possible to be able to stagger bosses very quickly. The huge additional multiplier from Gloom, and this is where we're also going to pick up extra ranks on our Amulet. And then finally picking up Terror. Now that'll actually work with Shadow Blight. We're not maxing out Corpse Tendrils because you really don't need to. You get really diminished returns on actually reducing the cooldown since Abhorrent Decrepify is going to do so much work for us. And we do still get to pick up the free vulnerable damage bonus here, a free 1.2 damage bonus to all of our damage over time, and our Shadow Blight, which can crit. Seems really good. And then obviously Bone Storm with Supreme Bone Storm, maxing out Standalone for the damage reduction, maxing out Memento Mori for all the sacrifice bonuses, and then we're picking up Shadow Blight. Now that we've seen that, let's go ahead and look through the gear. Again, going very quickly, I'm just going to point out nuances when it would otherwise not be obvious why we want the stats. We're using a wand for the lucky hit chance, and then you'll notice the stats that I picked for damage. Damage to close, which we will always proc since we're always in melee range, huge amount of intelligence, huge amount of all stats, and then damage to affected by shadow damage over time. Basically every other damage type is either too niche, only applies to when they're injured, only applies to when they're healthy, or something like that. We want to be picking up damage types that are direct multipliers to our base damage, so as much primary stat as we possibly can get, and then the biggest damage types that will always apply. So we're always going to do shadow damage over time. We're always going to be close to the targets. Here's where I'm putting Ultimate Shadow to turn Bone Storm into a darkness skill that does shadow damage and applies shadow damage over time. It's basically one of the best aspects on this build. And then most notably, you'll see that I'm also picking up damage over time for the gem in the socket. Technically could go with crit damage when the target is vulnerable, just to be able to increase Shadow Blight damage a little bit here, as well as increasing Bone Storm's damage a little bit. But since that damage over time is now a multiplier for Shadow Blight damage, I think that this is just pound for pound better, considering it also increases all of our primary damage outside of that Shadow Blight proc. For the offhand, we're obviously using a focus for the cooldown reduction, the 2 sources of lucky hit, additional intelligence, and then more cooldown reduction as a stat. So we're putting Blood Soaked. Not only does it remove the movement speed penalties so that we can actually use Blood Mist as a mobility skill with the Ghostwalker aspect, but it also leaves behind a small trail of shadow damage, which is going to do an okay amount since it now is scaling with so many more modifiers, but mostly it's just there to proc Shadow Blight as often as possible. And then we're also putting another damage over time gem here. For the helmet, life, lucky hit chance when you have barrier, cooldown reduction, and intelligence. If you feel like you're dying too much, you can swap out the intelligence for armor instead. And then here's where we're putting might, so that every time that we use reap, we're going to gain up to 35 damage reduction from the base skill and then from the aspect. Nothing interesting on the armor, just making sure to pick up damage reduction from close and damage reduction from targets who are shadowed, since again we're able to proc those all the time. The maximum life armor, and here's where we're putting disobedience. We're going to be socketing rubies into all of our armor because maximum life is just the best effective life bonus that we can have on at this point. Obviously, we're using Howl from Below. Now, you could definitely use legendary gloves with a decent damage scaling aspect. Probably want to pick up crit chance, lucky hit chance, attack speed, and then any other good stat on your gloves. But Howl from Below are definitely going to be the best option moving forward. For the pants, same as the chest, but instead of picking up armor here, we are picking up ranks to corpse explosion for the most damage possible there. And then here's where we put Shielding Storm to basically stay completely invincible. Then for the boots, movement speed, corpse tendrils to reduce that cooldown, and then intelligence and all stats. You could also go with dodge chance, or you could also go with resistances instead of the intelligence and all stats in case you just so happen to not reach the resistance cap. For the amulet, movement speed, rank to corpse skills, ranks to gloom as the best damage modifier. And then here I currently have shadow damage over time. This one's a little bit cheeky. You probably want to put armor or a damage reduction here, again, if you happen to be dying, but the end game probably wants to stack as much shadow damage over time to scale Shadow Blight as powerfully as possible. And here's where we're putting Blighted to get the biggest damage multiplier that we can. And we're currently using diamonds in here. You might end up having to use individual gems to rank up individual resistances to get them over cap. But just as a safeguard right now, that's what we're putting in. And now our rings are going to start looking a lot different. Obviously, maximum life, damage to close, and then lucky hit chance and crit chance. You'll notice that just with our stats right now, we're sitting at 29% crit chance. That means that with Grasping Veins, which we have in just a second, and Bone Storm, we're at 69% nice chance to crit on this build. And that's good enough for us to reasonably assume that we'll be able to proc that crit multiplier on Shadow Blight, as well as get a little bit of additional damage since we do pick up some in the Paragon tree. We're also putting Decay here, which is an additional multiplier of Shadow Blight's proc damage. This is by and large the biggest total damage bonus that we can get against a single target, so I highly recommend picking up Decay. A lot of people ask me between Blighted and Decay and Blighted. Until I have a target dummy that literally has a damage calculator on it, I will not lie to you. I do not know which one does better single target damage. I've never felt bad having Blighted on the amulet and Decay on the ring, but if it turns out that it's slightly better to run Decay in season 2, you basically just swap them. And then same stats on the ring again, and then here's where we're putting Grasping Veins to get that additional crit chance for Shadow Blight and the additional crit multiplier for Shadow Blight whenever you successfully proc it. For the Book of the Dead, we're sacrificing Reapers for the additional shadow damage, we're sacrificing Cold Mages for the additional multiplier against a vulnerable target, and then we are sacrificing Iron Golem. You could also sacrifice Blood Golem for the additional maximum life, again if you're feeling a little bit squishy, but technically speaking, if we can reasonably assume that 69% of the time we're critting, then getting the additional 1.3 multiplier on our Shadow Blight crit damage is a really good scaler. I'm not going to bore you to death with a Paragon since you'll be able to see it yourself, but I just want to go over the choices that we made for glyphs and why I think they're going to be so powerful. Scourge is going to go into our second most powerful intelligence board on the starter board. This is where we're going to max out intelligence, get that biggest shadow damage over time to have the biggest multiplier against our Shadow Blight proc. And that's also going to gain us that 1.1 multiplier the moment that we deal shadow damage to a target. I'm also reaching out to pick up additional resistances because I do think you're going to need them to actually reach cap. And then you'll notice I'm also picking up the additional damage nodes here and kind of pathing through to be as efficient as possible. Walking into the Wither board, we obviously want to pick up the legendary node. We want to pick up Dragging Shadows for even more damage reduction. We want to pick up Gnawing Darkness for even more damage to elites and damage to targets affected by shadow damage. We're going to be picking up Lingering Shadows for more shadow damage over time. And then in the actual glyph, we're picking up Control. We're going to pop out of the top up into the center Scent of Death board. Obviously want to pick up the legendary node. I am picking up the Ruin node. I'm basically picking up 1 damage to healthy node and 1 damage to injured. Both of these are niche because one only happens for the first 20% of the monster's life, and then one only happens for the remaining 35% of the monster's life. But if I'm increasing our kill speed against 55% of the monster's total life bar, that's probably good enough for the point investment on the Paragon board. Here's where we're putting in Bibber for a huge damage while healthy additional bonus, building into willpower, and then you notice I'm picking up a few additional damage to injured nodes that I otherwise wouldn't normally need to do. It turns out when I was finished building out this board, I had 4 extra points, so I dropped those points into nodes that I hadn't previously maxed out. Building into Flesh Eater, you'll notice I'm building down to Stifle. This is our damage to injured monsters node. It also gives us a little bit of critical strike damage, again for Shadow Blight when that does proc. Obviously we're picking up the Flesh Eater legendary node for a huge multiplier there, and then we're building into Darkness. Again, Darkness will scale off of intelligence, and Flesh Eater is the biggest intelligence board that we have available to us. We're also picking up additional damage to elites and then additional resistances as well. Building into our final board for Bone Graft for the biggest dexterity board that we can get our hands on, and then we're building into this Territorial. Not only are we always close, we get a huge additive damage bonus for damage to close here, but it also gains us an additional 10% damage reduction since we're going to be in the thick of things whenever we get out of Blood Mist. Like I said, you can find this build planner in our public facing Discord. The link is now fixed in the description down below. I have a Blood Lance build. I have a Blood Surge build based off of some of the recommendations from people that have come to the Discord from my previous video. So thank you so much with that theory crafting. And now I'm maintaining the Infinimist build here. Obviously, once the build guides are updated on max roll, this is all going to convert into max roll guides. And then I also have the Vampire Powers analysis here. I'll have a list of them in the spreadsheet that you can go take a look at. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that this helped you in your theory crafting of how your Infinimist or Shadow Necromancer build might look going into season 2. I'm incredibly excited for dot builds. I really think that they're just going to super overshine in comparison to what they were doing before, and Infinimist was just on the cusp of being an S tier build in my opinion. If you haven't already, leave a like on the video right now if you're like, hell yeah, this is exactly what I'm looking for. Also consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Now that people are coming back to Diablo 4 and enjoying the content, I'm excited that they're getting the game that they want, but we gotta kind of help bump me back into the algorithm because it turns out it took quite a bit of a dip if you've been noticing. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.